The orbital station hung in the darkness of space like a metallic spider web, its corridors filled with the sounds of alien languages and mechanical humming. Inside the restricted sector, in a cage made of reinforced steel and energy barriers, a dragon waited. It had been waiting for 3 months now, and in that time, not a single being had shown it any kindness or understanding. The dragon's scales were the color of burnt amber, shifting occasionally to deep crimson when the creature moved. Its wings, folded tightly against its body, bore the marks of long confinement. One horn had a jagged scar running down its length, a reminder of battles fought long ago in a world that no longer existed. Its eyes were large and golden, holding an intelligence that most visitors to the station completely missed or chose to ignore. The Vrexian traders had rejected the dragon first. They came with their thin, elongated bodies and their cold, calculating stares, examining the creature as if it were nothing more than a piece of cargo to be evaluated. Too unpredictable, they had said, their translator devices clicking and whirring as they spoke. The temperament is unstable. The risk outweighs the benefit. They had turned away and never returned. Next came the Quillith, a species known for their harsh judgments and their refusal to acknowledge anything they deemed beneath their notice. They circled the cage once, their crystalline bodies reflecting the station's artificial light, and dismissed the dragon with a single word translated into the station's common language: primitive. They had walked away with their heads held high, as if even breathing the same air as the dragon was an offense to their superiority. Other species passed through, and others still. The sentient collective sent a representative, a being of pure energy contained in a transparent suit, and their translator implants simply refused to register the dragon's existence at all. It was as if the creature was invisible to them, unworthy of their attention or processing power. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. The dragon remained alone in its cage, watching the endless stream of indifferent faces pass by. The station staff fed the creature regularly, keeping it alive but offering nothing more. They did not speak to it. They did not study it with curiosity. They simply maintained it the way one might maintain a broken piece of machinery that might someday prove useful. The director of the station, a stern woman named Elizabeth with gray hair and colder eyes, had ordered that the dragon be kept alive but otherwise ignored. "We do not yet understand its true value," she had said during a staff meeting. "Until we do, treat it as we would any other specimen. Feed it. Keep it secure. Observe from a distance." But on this particular day something changed. A boy walked through the restricted sector where he had no business being. His name was Thomas and he was 14 years old. He was the son of Margaret, one of the station's language experts, and he had inherited his mother's curiosity about the unknown and the forgotten. Thomas had a habit of taking wrong turns in the station's corridors, of exploring places he was not supposed to go, of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. Thomas had been heading toward the observation deck when he had missed a turn and found himself in the restricted sector. Most people would have turned back immediately, worried about security protocols and the possibility of getting into trouble. But Thomas was not most people. He noticed things that others overlooked. He wondered about things that others accepted without question. As he walked through the sector, he heard a sound, a low, rumbling breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep within an ancient chest. He followed the sound until he came to a cage, and in that cage he saw the dragon. For a moment, Thomas simply stood still, staring. He had read stories about dragons, tales from old Earth books that his mother had in her personal collection. But he had never expected to see one, not here on a space station where everything was metal and technology and carefully controlled environments. The creature was both more impressive and more pitiful than any story had suggested. Its scales caught the light beautifully, shifting through shades of amber and red. But its posture was one of resignation, as if it had given up hoping for anything better than this cage. Thomas stepped closer to the bars. He noticed something that made his heart suddenly quicken. Around the dragon's neck was a band of metal, old and intricate, engraved with markings that seemed to catch the station's artificial light in strange and deliberate ways. The engravings were beautiful, but more than that, they were meaningful. They were words in a language that Thomas somehow recognized, even though he could not have explained why. His mother had taught him to identify patterns in ancient writing systems. She had shown him examples from civilizations that had risen and fallen across thousands of years. She had explained to him that language was a window into the minds and hearts of people long dead, that every symbol and mark carried weight and history and truth. Thomas had absorbed these lessons like a sponge absorbs water, and now, standing before this dragon, looking at the markings on its necklace, he felt something click into place in his mind. The dragon turned its head slowly, and its golden eyes fixed directly on Thomas. There was no aggression in that gaze, no hunger or rage. Instead, there was something that felt almost like recognition, as if the creature was seeing Thomas not as just another indifferent visitor, but as someone who might actually understand. Thomas's hands began to shake. He pressed his face closer to the bars, trying to read every detail of the engravings. The script was old, far older than anything that should exist in a modern space station. It belonged to a civilization that had supposedly been extinct for 10,000 years, lost to the depths of time and forgotten by the universe. But the words were still there. The words were still real. And somehow, Thomas knew that this dragon and this necklace, and these words were connected to a mystery far larger than anything he had ever imagined. His ordinary day on the station had suddenly become extraordinary, and Thomas stood before the dragon's cage, trembling with the weight of discovery, unable to look away from those golden eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of ages. Thomas did not sleep that night. He lay in his bunk in the small quarters he shared with his mother, staring at the ceiling, unable to close his eyes. His mind kept returning to the dragon, to the necklace, to those strange and ancient markings that seemed to burn themselves into his memory with perfect clarity. He could see every curve, every angle, every detail of the engravings as if they were still right in front of him, glowing in the station's sterile light. When morning came, Thomas waited until his mother left for her work in the linguistics department. Margaret worked long hours, cataloging and analyzing language samples from across the galaxy. She was dedicated to her research, sometimes so focused on her work that she barely noticed when Thomas came and went. This morning he was grateful for her distraction. He needed access to something she kept secured in her personal files, something that only her credentials could open. Thomas moved quietly through their quarters and sat down at his mother's workstation. His heart pounded as he entered the access code she had taught him long ago, back when he was younger and she thought he might want to follow in her professional footsteps. The screen flickered to life, displaying a menu of archived databases and research files. Thomas's fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose, searching for the section labeled Ancient Scripts and Dead Languages. His mother had spent years studying old writing systems before taking the assignment on the station. She had worked on translations and interpretations of languages that had not been spoken for thousands of years. She had filled entire databases with her research, her notes, her theories about the connections between different civilizations and the words they had used to communicate with one another. Thomas had always found this work fascinating, but never before had it felt so urgent, so important, so vital to his understanding of something real and present. He accessed the database and began searching through the files. There were languages from Earth's ancient past: Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sumerian cuneiform, Sanskrit. There were scripts from civilizations that had existed on other worlds, long before humanity had reached the stars. There were symbols and markings that his mother had collected from archaeological sites scattered across multiple planets and star systems. Thomas knew he was looking for something specific, though he was not entirely sure what it would look like until he found it. The markings on the dragon's necklace were old, impossibly old, but they were not random. They had structure. They had pattern. They had meaning. There had to be a reference, a comparison point, something in his mother's extensive archives that matched what he had seen. He searched through file after file, his frustration growing as nothing seemed to match. Hours passed. His eyes began to hurt from staring at the screen. Then, just as he was about to give up, something caught his attention. A file labeled Archive World Scripts Civilization Collapse Era. His mother had only a few files about this particular civilization. Most researchers considered it irrelevant because the civilization had been extinct for so long that there was almost no surviving evidence of its existence. Thomas opened the file and began scrolling through the images of ancient scripts. The first few samples did not match. The second set showed promise but fell short. Then, on the third page of the file, Thomas saw it. The symbols were unmistakable, identical to the markings on the dragon's necklace. His hands trembled as he pulled up the translation key his mother had created for this particular language. The symbols began to form words in his mind. His mother had taught him well, and he had studied languages with her since he was young, absorbing information the way children absorb knowledge when they are genuinely interested. The first word was clear: protector. The second word followed: of. The third, the. And then last, nest. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He continued reading, moving through each symbol carefully, making sure he understood correctly. The full inscription on the necklace read: Protector of the Last Nest, Keeper of the Promise, Bound until Freedom Comes. He read it again and then a third time, making absolutely certain that he had not made an error in his translation. But there was no mistake. The meaning was clear, unmistakable, and profoundly important. This was not a decoration or a random piece of jewelry. This was a declaration. This was a binding. This was a promise written in a language that had been dead for 10,000 years, inscribed on a creature that supposedly did not exist. Thomas's mind raced with questions. Who had written these words? When had they been written? What promise was being referred to? And most importantly, what did it mean that a dragon, a creature that should not exist, that the entire galaxy had deemed worthless and primitive, was wearing this necklace? He made copies of the translation and saved them to his personal data pad, careful to cover his tracks so that no one would know he had accessed his mother's secured files. Then he closed the workstation and sat in silence for a long moment, processing what he had discovered. The dragon in the restricted sector was not what everyone believed. It was not a primitive creature to be studied and catalogued and eventually discarded when it no longer served a purpose. It was a guardian. It was a keeper of promises. It was bound, deliberately, intentionally, by means of ancient and powerful words, to something or someone. And that binding carried within it a promise of freedom. Thomas understood then that the dragon had been waiting. It had been waiting for someone to see past the cage, past the indifference, past the labels that everyone else had placed upon it. It had been waiting for someone to truly understand what the necklace meant. And now Thomas knew the truth. The only question that remained was what he would do with this knowledge, and whether he had the courage to help a creature that the entire galaxy had abandoned. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas became obsessed with uncovering the dragon's history. He spent every free moment in the station's research archives, searching through old records and historical documents that most people never bothered to look at. The archive system was massive, containing millions of files spanning centuries of space exploration and discovery. But Thomas was patient and methodical, following threads of information wherever they led, piecing together a story that had been buried and forgotten. He discovered that 10,000 years ago, a civilization had thrived on a world in a distant sector of space. This civilization, referred to in the old records as the Archive World, had been advanced far beyond anything that currently existed in the known galaxy. They had mastered technologies that modern scientists could barely comprehend. They had built cities that floated in the sky. They had created weapons and tools and machines that seemed almost magical in their capabilities. And they had lived alongside dragons as equals, partners, guardians of a peace that had lasted for thousands of years. Then something had gone terribly wrong. The records were unclear about what had caused the collapse, but the evidence was undeniable. The archive world had fallen. Entire cities had been destroyed. Civilizations had crumbled to dust. And the dragons, majestic and powerful as they were, had not been able to prevent the catastrophe. Most had perished in the chaos. A few had managed to survive, but they were scattered, lost, forgotten in the vastness of space. Thomas found references to an explorer named Robert who had lived about 100 years ago. Robert had been one of the first humans to venture into the deep space territories, searching for evidence of ancient civilizations. He had discovered the ruins of the archive world and had found something remarkable among those ruins. A single dragon, somehow still alive despite the passage of 10,000 years. The dragon had been in a state of hibernation, preserved by ancient technology that still functioned, still operated, still maintained the creature in a form of suspended animation. Robert had made a choice that Thomas found both fascinating and troubling. Instead of capturing the dragon or studying it or reporting his discovery to the authorities, Robert had done something different. He had performed a ceremony, using ancient words and ancient rituals that he had learned from the ruins themselves. He had created a binding, a promise inscribed on a necklace made from the same mysterious metal that the archive world had used in their most important creations. The words of the binding were clear. The dragon would be protected, cared for, and eventually freed, but only when a time came that conditions were right, when a specific heir emerged who carried the bloodline of Robert in their veins. Robert had then disappeared from the records. Thomas found no further documentation about what had happened to the explorer. It was as if Robert had made his promise to the dragon and then simply vanished, leaving the world without explanation. Some records suggested he had died in the deep space territories, lost to the vast darkness. Others hinted that he had deliberately erased himself from history to protect the dragon's secret. Thomas could not know which version was true, but it did not matter. What mattered was that Robert had bound himself to the dragon through a promise that would echo across 100 years. Thomas then made a discovery that made his blood run cold. He accessed his mother's employment records and found something that seemed almost too convenient to be coincidence. Margaret, his mother, had not been randomly assigned to the orbital station. She had been specifically requested by the station's director, Elizabeth. The request had come through official channels, but when Thomas dug deeper, he found evidence that Elizabeth had been searching for someone with Margaret's expertise in ancient languages for years. Elizabeth had known who Margaret was. She had known about Margaret's research. She had deliberately brought her to the station for a specific reason. Thomas understood the trap now. Elizabeth was waiting for Margaret to eventually translate the necklace. Elizabeth knew that the dragon was valuable, but she did not know why. The director of the station was smart enough to realize that an ancient creature wearing a necklace inscribed in a dead language must be worth something significant. But she did not understand the promise. She did not care about the dragon's freedom or its dignity or its right to choose its own path. She only cared about profit, about power, about the enormous amount of money that collectors across the galaxy would pay for a confirmed survivor of an extinct civilization. Thomas found records of wealthy buyers, private collectors who would pay millions for rare and impossible specimens. There were legends among the ultra-rich about the archive world, stories about the power of dragon blood and dragon scales and dragon bone. Some believed that these materials possessed properties that could extend life, could grant abilities, could transform a person into something more than human. Thomas realized with growing horror that once Elizabeth confirmed the dragon's origin, once Margaret's translation was complete and documented, the creature would be sold to the highest bidder. It would be taken away from the station and delivered to some unknown destination in the outer systems. What happened after that would be even worse. Thomas sat in the archives late one night, the weight of his knowledge pressing down on him like a physical force. He understood now why no one had wanted the dragon. They had not wanted it because they did not understand what it truly was. They had seen only a creature that did not fit into their understanding of the galaxy, something that did not serve an obvious purpose, something that seemed primitive and worthless. They had not bothered to look deeper, to search for meaning, to discover the truth hidden beneath the surface. But now that Thomas had found that truth, he faced an impossible choice. If he revealed what he knew to his mother, she would eventually tell Elizabeth, and the director would move forward with her plans to sell the dragon. If he told anyone else, the same result would likely follow. The only way to protect the dragon would be to stay silent, to hide his knowledge, to pretend he knew nothing. But how could he stay silent when he understood what was about to happen? How could he watch the dragon, a creature that had survived 10,000 years, that had kept its promise through centuries of loneliness, face slavery or destruction because of his inaction? Thomas knew that he could not. He would have to do something, though what that something might be, he could not yet imagine. Thomas spent the next week planning carefully. He could not act on impulse. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and everything would be lost. He had to think through every detail, anticipate every obstacle, and prepare for consequences he could not fully predict. The stakes were too high for anything less than perfect preparation. The first thing he needed to understand was how the binding on the necklace actually worked. It was clearly not magical in the way that old stories describe magic. Thomas had learned enough about technology from his mother's work to understand that the necklace was actually an incredibly sophisticated piece of engineering, far beyond anything that current human technology could create. The metal itself was not ordinary. Under microscopic examination in the station's research lab, it would have revealed properties that defied conventional understanding. But Thomas could not take the necklace to the research lab without drawing attention to himself. Instead, he studied the ancient texts and documents that described how the archive world had used technology. Their approach had been different from modern humanity's approach. They had created machines and devices that worked in harmony with biological systems, that responded to specific genetic signatures and conscious intent. They had built security systems that recognized bloodlines and family connections. They had designed tools that could distinguish between authorized and unauthorized users with perfect accuracy. Thomas realized that the binding on the necklace worked on the same principle. It was designed to respond to a specific genetic pattern, to recognize someone who carried the blood of Robert, the explorer who had created the binding 100 years ago. But that genetic pattern would have been diluted over the generations. Robert would have had children, and those children would have had their own children, spreading his bloodline across time. The necklace would have been programmed to recognize a descendant, even if that descendant carried only a fraction of Robert's original genetic material. Thomas thought about his mother. Margaret had never told him much about her family history. She had mentioned an ancestor who was an explorer, someone who had traveled to distant places and made important discoveries. She had said it casually as if it were not important. But Thomas now wondered if that ancestor might have been Robert. The timeline was possible. The profession was similar. The interest in ancient civilizations and old languages could have been passed down through the family, inherited like a genetic trait. If Thomas was correct, then his mother carried Robert's bloodline in her veins. And if his mother carried it, then Thomas carried it as well. He was a descendant of the man who had created the binding. He was part of the family that the necklace had been waiting to recognize. Thomas obtained access to the genetics database through his mother's credentials. It was not difficult. The station's security was designed to keep people out, not to prevent authorized users from accessing files. He ran a comparison between his own genetic material and the genetic samples that were stored in the ancient archives from the archive world period. The results confirmed what he had suspected. His genetic signature contained markers that matched patterns from that ancient civilization. The connection was distant, diluted by 10,000 years of separation, but it was unmistakably real. Thomas was Robert's heir. The binding on the necklace had been waiting for him. The knowledge both thrilled and terrified him. It meant he had the capability to free the dragon. It also meant that the responsibility for doing so fell entirely on his shoulders. No one else could help him. No one else could do this. If he failed, the dragon would remain imprisoned, and the binding would never be fulfilled. He began to gather the things he would need. He forged access credentials using a portable hacking device that he had borrowed from the maintenance section of the station. He studied the guard rotation schedules for the restricted sector. He memorized the layout of the corridors and the location of security cameras. He learned when the night shifts changed and when there were brief windows of time when the restricted area would be less heavily monitored. He also studied the words of release. In the ancient texts and documents, there were references to a ritual of unbinding, a specific set of words spoken in the archive world language that would deactivate the necklace's security protocols. The words were complex and required exact pronunciation. Thomas practiced them over and over, speaking quietly in his quarters when his mother was asleep, making sure he could say them perfectly without hesitation or mistake. On the night he had chosen for the attempt, Thomas felt sick with nervousness. His hands shook as he dressed in dark clothing that would make him less visible in the station's corridors. He checked his forged credentials one more time, confirming that they would pass any security scan. He had set his alarm for 2 a.m, the quietest time on the station when most of the crew was asleep and the night shift was at its thinnest. When the alarm sounded, Thomas got out of bed carefully, trying not to make any noise. His mother was sleeping in the adjacent room, and he did not want to risk waking her. He moved through their quarters like a ghost, slipping through the door and into the corridor beyond. The station was different at night. The lights were dimmed to a lower level to simulate a natural day-night cycle. The corridors were nearly empty. Thomas could hear only the soft hum of the station's life support systems and the occasional footstep of a night shift worker in a distant section. He made his way toward the restricted sector, keeping to the shadows, moving quickly but carefully. When he reached the entrance to the restricted area, his heart was pounding so hard he thought surely someone would hear it. He scanned his forged credentials at the security panel. For a moment nothing happened. Then with a soft beep and a click, the door slid open. He was in. The restricted sector was darker than the main corridors. Thomas moved through it slowly, letting his eyes adjust. And then, ahead of him, he saw the cage. And inside the cage, he saw the dragon, awake and watching, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to come. Thomas approached the cage slowly, his heart thundering in his chest. The dragon did not move. It simply watched him with those golden eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 10,000 years. The creature's breathing was calm and steady, as if it had always known that this moment would come, as if it had been waiting through all the long months of captivity for this specific boy to arrive at this specific time. "I know what you are," Thomas whispered, keeping his voice low so that no one else could hear. "I know about the binding. I know about the promise. I know who you are." The dragon's tail curled slowly, deliberately, moving in a pattern that Thomas recognized from the ancient texts as a gesture of acknowledgement. The creature understood him. More than that, the dragon seemed relieved, as if a burden it had been carrying for so long was finally being shared with another living being. Thomas moved closer to the energy barrier that protected the cage. The barrier hummed with a low frequency, a constant vibration that he could feel in his bones. He reached out his hand and it passed through the barrier without resistance. The system recognized his genetic signature. His mother's bloodline gave him access to technology that had been created 10,000 years before he was born. He stepped through the barrier and into the cage. The dragon raised its head slightly, watching his every movement. Up close, Thomas could see the wear and tear of captivity on the creature's body. Its scales, though still beautiful in their shifting colors, were dull in places. Its wings bore marks where they had been pressed against its body for too long. The scar on its horn was more pronounced than it had appeared from a distance. This creature had suffered. This creature had endured countless indignities and remained patient through it all. Thomas approached the necklace carefully. The metal band hung around the dragon's neck, secured by means that Thomas did not fully understand. As he drew near, the engravings on the necklace began to glow faintly, responding to his presence, recognizing his genetic connection to Robert, to the promise that had been made so long ago. "I'm going to free you," Thomas said quietly. "I'm going to speak the words. And then you'll be free to make your own choice. To go wherever you want to go. To be whatever you want to be." The dragon made a low sound, something between a rumble and a purr, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within its ancient chest. It was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of hope. Thomas took a deep breath and began to speak. The words of the archive world language felt strange on his human tongue, sounds that his throat was not naturally designed to make. But he had practiced them countless times and now they came out clearly and precisely. He spoke each syllable with perfect intention, letting the ancient language flow through him like a force beyond his control. The words carried meaning and power and the weight of a promise that had endured for 100 years. As Thomas spoke, the necklace began to glow brighter. The engravings lit up with a soft golden light that grew more intense with each word. The dragon's scales began to shimmer in response, reflecting the light of the binding as it prepared to release its hold. Thomas could feel something changing in the air around him, something fundamental shifting in the nature of reality itself. When he spoke the final word, the necklace flared with brilliant golden light that filled the entire cage. Thomas had to shield his eyes against the brightness. When the light faded, the necklace had transformed. The metal had become liquid for just an instant, flowing away from the dragon's neck like water, and then it had simply ceased to exist. The binding was broken. The promise had been fulfilled. For a moment, there was perfect silence in the restricted sector. The dragon did not move. It simply sat there, experiencing freedom for the first time in 100 years, perhaps struggling to comprehend what it meant to no longer be bound, no longer connected to the ancient promise that had defined its existence. Then alarms began to sound throughout the station. Red lights flashed in every corridor. The security system had detected the tampering with the necklace, the disruption of the binding protocol. Thomas realized that he had made a critical mistake. He had assumed he had more time, that the alarm system would not activate immediately. But of course it would. Elizabeth had programmed the system to alert her the moment anything changed with the dragon. Thomas heard footsteps in the corridors outside the restricted sector. Voices shouting commands. The sound of weapons being drawn. Security forces were coming. They would be here in minutes, perhaps less. The dragon stood up on its powerful legs, spreading its wings wide for the first time in captivity. The wings were enormous, far larger than Thomas had realized they would be. They filled the entire cage, their span nearly touching both sides. The creature looked down at the boy who had freed it, and Thomas saw something in those golden eyes that he had not seen before. He saw recognition. He saw gratitude. He saw something that felt almost like love, the bond that forms between two beings who have chosen to trust one another completely. The dragon lowered its head until its snout was just inches from Thomas's face. The boy felt the warmth of the creature's breath, smelled something ancient and primal, something that reminded him of lightning and fire and the deep places beneath the earth where old magic still dwelt. The dragon touched its forehead gently to his forehead, and in that contact, Thomas felt something extraordinary. He felt the weight of 10,000 years of solitude. He felt the patience of a guardian waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. He felt the loneliness of being the last of one's kind. And he felt, most powerfully of all, a profound gratitude and a commitment that went beyond words or logic. The footsteps grew louder. The voices were closer now, just on the other side of the barrier. Thomas heard someone shouting into a communication device, calling for backup, calling for weapons, calling for authorization to use lethal force if necessary. The dragon turned toward the barrier and spread its wings fully. The energy that protected the cage flickered and failed, unable to contain the power that the creature now unleashed. The barrier dissolved like morning frost under the heat of the dragon's ancient magic, and the cage door burst open. Thomas grabbed onto the dragon's neck, his fingers finding purchase in the space between the creature's scales. He could feel the muscles beneath, powerful and ready. The dragon launched forward, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for a creature of its size. It burst through the wall of the restricted sector as if the metal and reinforced steel were nothing more than paper. Alarms shrieked. Laser fire erupted from security weapons. But nothing could stop the dragon. Nothing could slow it down. The creature crashed through corridor after corridor, heading toward the docking bay where ships were stored. Thomas held on tightly, his eyes wide with fear and wonder and a wild kind of exhilaration. They were doing it. They were actually doing it. They were escaping. The dragon reached the docking bay and leaped toward the nearest ship, a small cargo vessel that was meant for short-distance deliveries between stations. The creature ripped the doors open with raw strength, and Thomas guided it toward the pilot's seat using his access credentials and his knowledge of station systems. As the ship's engines roared to life, Thomas looked back at the station through the viewing window. Security forces were running toward the docking bay, weapons raised, but they were too late. The ship was already disengaging from the station's mooring clamps. The dragon, still holding Thomas close, guided the vessel toward the open darkness of space. When they cleared the station's perimeter, the dragon released a sound that Thomas had never heard before, a cry that echoed through the emptiness of space, a song of joy and freedom and release. And as the station receded behind them, becoming smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light in the vast darkness, Thomas understood that he had made his choice. He had chosen the dragon. He had chosen freedom over safety. He had chosen to believe in a promise that most of the galaxy had forgotten. The authorities would search for them. The news would spread across the systems. But Thomas and the dragon would be far away by then, traveling through the stars, writing a new chapter in a story that had been waiting 10,000 years to be told. A story of a boy and a dragon. A story of freedom and trust and the power of one person's willingness to see what others could not see, to understand what others could not understand, to believe in what others had abandoned. In the darkness between worlds, they flew on together, no longer bound by the constraints of a dying station or the indifference of a galaxy that had forgotten how to wonder.